We've used routing data and query string values as inputs to our search action, but let's also talk about the different types of outputs we can return from an action. We just used the content result to return a string literal from our action, and the producing method, which is a factory type method to produce a content result, is called content. So we can simply say return content and pass a string into this method, which represents the literal content we want to send to a client. There are many other types of action results available. The name column represents the action result derived class being used. So all of these class names that you see here, they all derive from action result. And the producing method is the factory method you can invoke to construct a particular result. Previously, we've used the view method to produce a view result, and we saw in the introduction how this will render a view that is somewhere inside of our views folder. There are also results we can use to stream a file back to the client, tell them they've made an unauthorized request, return data in JSON format, and send back an HTTP code telling the browser to redirect to a different URL. Let's see how some of these different action results behave by switching over to Visual Studio. We've seen how the content and view results work. Let's try a different result, one of the redirect results. You can see there's various types of redirects, everything from redirect permanent, which sends the browser an HTTP 301 code and say, if you visit this URL, I want you to permanently redirect to Microsoft.com. There's also a redirect that we can use to go to a specific action that's inside of our application. So we can say, go to the index action of the home controller. And if we build this project and refresh the page, our browser will end up being redirected back to the front page of the application. What's interesting about redirect to action is that it actually coordinates with the routing engine behind the scenes. It walks up to the routing engine and says, if I want to reach the URL that would produce controller equals home, action equals index, what would that URL look like? And based on the way we've configured the routing engine will reply with the proper URL. We can also pass additional values through the URL as long as the URL knows about them through this configuration. So if we wanted to redirect to the Cuisine controller, invoke the search action, and pass along a specific name, we can do that. That's an additional parameter to redirect to action. So let's do this. Let's say that if someone enters a name and we just get the default that is star, let's make some sort of redirect here that would send the person to the search action of the Cuisine controller, and I'm going to specify route values. In route values, I'm going to say that I want the name parameter to be equal to French. What would that look like? What would that URL look like? That's what I want you to send back to the browser. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll return content with the name inside. So after we redirect back with French in the URL, we should be able to see French. So let's try to go to Cuisine. And you can see that the browser was redirected to /cuisine/French. That was via this redirect to action statement. You can also interact a little more directly with your routing configuration by saying redirect to route. When you redirect to a route, you can specify a route name and route values. So I could say, please go to the Cuisine route. And then again, route values would be name. This time let's make it German. And let's do a quick build and come back and take French out of the URL. And now we get German. So in this case, we redirected to a route by name, and the routing engine was able to figure out that the default parameter values here would be Cuisine and search. We just gave it a name to pass along also. Let's try a couple more results. Just for kicks, instead of doing a redirect, let's try to return a file result. So when we return a file, one of the things we can do is pass in the byte array that would make up the file contents, or a file stream. We can also just pass in a file name and a content type. So for the file name, let's just send back our site.css file. So I'm going to say, please return what is in the content directory site.css, and I'm using server map path so that we actually pick up a physical file name to pass to this file result, and the tilde character there will make sure that everything is properly resolved so that we're looking inside of this content directory that is in the root of the site. So send back site.css, and the type is going to be text/CSS. Let's do a build and try this one out. We'll take German off of the end. And you can see that Internet Explorer downloaded the CSS file from the site and opened it up in Notepad. Let's do one more. Let's try to produce a JSON result. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. We'll be using it quite a bit later in the course when we start looking at the AJAX features of ASP.NET MVC. To produce JSON, all we need to do is invoke this JSON method and pass in an object, any type of object. What will happen behind the scenes is that a JavaScript serializer will run through that object and serialize it into JSON for us. We can even pass in an anonymously typed object. So I could just say, give me something new that has a property called cuisine name, set that equal to this name, and that's what we want to send back to the client, just that single object. I am going to have to add an additional parameter here that will allow the MVC framework to return JSON during an HTTP GET request. We'll talk about that later in this course. Essentially, that is there to help prevent JSON hijacking, which can happen during a GET request. If you're ever sending sensitive data back on a JSON request, you probably do not want to allow this parameter. We'll talk about that later in the course. But with that in place, let's do a build. Out here in the browser, let's remove German from the URL and enter. Internet Explorer wants me to download a file, so we will go ahead and download it into my downloads folder, and then we will open it up using Notepad. And that is JSON data. Cuisine name is a star.